I woke up at 6 in the morning to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling through my backyard. And when I looked out my bedroom window, I saw 3 workers with industrial pumps draining my koi pond, while a woman in a pressed pantsuit stood there directing them like she owned the place. My name is Vincent Yarrow, and I have lived in Meadowbrook Estates in Gilbert, Arizona, for the past 8 years. I bought this 5-acre property specifically because it sat at the end of a private cul-de-sac with minimal HOA interference, or so I thought when I signed those papers. The previous owner had built a beautiful pond system that connected to the natural aquifer running beneath the property, and I had spent thousands of dollars over the years stocking it with expensive koi, installing filtration systems, and creating a small ecosystem that attracted local wildlife. That pond was not just a water feature. It was my sanctuary after long days working as an aerospace engineer at the Boeing facility nearby. I threw on jeans and a shirt, not bothering with shoes as I sprinted across my lawn. The morning air was already warm, typical for late April in Arizona, and the smell of disturbed earth and pond water hit my nostrils as I got closer. The woman turned when she heard me approaching, and I immediately recognized her as Brenda Patterson, the president of our HOA. She was in her mid-50s with blonde hair that looked too perfect to be natural and wore enough jewelry to fund a small country. "What the hell are you doing to my pond?" I shouted over the noise of the pumps. Brenda smiled that condescending smile I had seen at exactly 2 HOA meetings I had bothered attending. "Good morning, Vincent. We are simply borrowing some water for the community landscaping project at the front entrance. The city has imposed water restrictions, and we need to keep our plants alive." "You are stealing my water without permission," I said, trying to keep my voice level but failing. "Turn those pumps off right now." She pulled out a laminated document from her leather portfolio. "Actually, according to Section 12, Subsection 4 of the HOA bylaws, the association reserves the right to utilize any resources on member properties for the betterment of the community in times of need. This qualifies as a time of need." I grabbed the document from her perfectly manicured hands and scanned it. The text was dense and full of legal jargon, but nowhere did I see anything that explicitly gave them the right to drain private water sources. "This is complete garbage, Brenda. This section talks about maintenance access, not resource theft." "I disagree with your interpretation," she said calmly. "The board voted on this yesterday evening, 5-0, 5-0. There are 7 board members. The other 2 were unavailable." She gestured to the workers. "Keep going, gentlemen. We have a tight schedule." I watched in horror as my pond level dropped. I could see my koi swimming in increasingly shallow water, stressed and confused. Some of them were championship fish I had imported from Japan, each worth over $2,000. "Brenda, you are going to kill my fish. Stop this now or I am calling the police." She laughed, actually laughed. "The police will tell you this is a civil matter, Vincent. If you have a problem with the board's decision, you can file a formal complaint and wait for the next quarterly meeting in July. Until then, we are well within our rights." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher listened to my complaint and, just as Brenda predicted, told me this sounded like a civil dispute that did not require emergency services. She suggested I contact a lawyer. I hung up, my hand shaking with rage. "See," Brenda said. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have other properties to visit today. We are also utilizing the Henderson's pool and the Mitchell's irrigation well." She walked away toward a white Escalade parked on my driveway, her heels clicking against the pavement. The workers continued pumping for another 45 minutes until they had taken roughly 8,000 gallons, leaving my pond at about 30% capacity. My koi were huddled in the deepest section, and I could see the stress spots already forming on their scales. After the workers left, I spent the rest of the morning trying to stabilize the pond. I redirected water from my house and adjusted the filtration system, but the damage was done. Two of my oldest koi, a beautiful kohaku named Sunset and a sank I had raised from a fingerling, were already showing signs of shock. By afternoon, Sunset was dead, floating belly up near the waterfall feature. I buried Sunset near the Japanese maple tree at the edge of my property, my hands covered in dirt and my mind racing with anger. This was not just about water or money anymore. This was about principle. Brenda and her board thought they could do whatever they wanted, and clearly, they had been getting away with it for years. I went inside and started researching. The Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, had been established in 1998 when the neighborhood was first developed. Most of the original bylaws were standard, but I discovered something interesting as I dug through the county records at the public library's online database. The water rights in this area were complicated because the development sat on top of an ancient aquifer system that predated the HOA by millions of years. My property, specifically, had senior water rights because it was one of the original parcels subdivided from a cattle ranch in the 1960s. Those rights had been grandfathered in when the neighborhood was developed, which meant I had legal priority over the water beneath my land. But more interestingly, I discovered that the HOA's main landscaping system, which served the community entrance, the pool clubhouse, and various common areas, was connected to a well system that drew from the same aquifer. And that well system ran directly beneath my property. I spent the next 3 days gathering documentation. I pulled permits from the county, water rights certificates, and survey maps. I contacted a property lawyer named Richard Moss who specialized in HOA disputes and water rights. His office was in downtown Phoenix, and I drove the 40 minutes to meet with him on a Wednesday afternoon. Richard was in his 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened to my story while taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and whistled. They really drained your pond without permission, every drop they could pump, and you have senior water rights on that aquifer, certified and registered with the state since 1967. He flipped through the documents I had brought. Vincent, this is actually a fascinating case. The HOA clearly violated your property rights, and if your pond connects to the aquifer system, as you say, they may have also violated water allocation laws. But here is the interesting part. If the HOA well system crosses under your property, you may have legal grounds to restrict their access. Can I just turn off their water? Not exactly. You would need to follow proper legal procedures. However, if you were to physically block access to the well system at the point where it crosses your property line, that could be considered protecting your own water rights. It is a gray area, but given what they did to you, I think we could make a strong case for immediate protective action. What are the risks? They could sue you. But honestly, they open themselves up to a much bigger lawsuit by draining your pond. If you want to play hardball, I can send them a cease and desist letter and demand compensation for your losses. If they refuse, we file in civil court. How long would that take? Months, maybe a year if they drag it out. I thought about Sunset floating in the pond, about the stress on my remaining fish, about Brenda's smug face. What if I want faster results? Richard gave me a look that was half concern, half admiration. If you are asking me what I think you are asking, I cannot officially advise you to take unilateral action. but I can tell you that property owners have the right to protect their resources from unlawful taking. Whatever you decide to do, document everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. And do not do anything that could be construed as vandalism or destruction of property. I left his office with a plan forming in my mind. That evening, I walked my property line with a metal detector and ground-penetrating radar unit I borrowed from a friend who did geological surveys. It took me most of the night, but I finally located the main water line running from the HOA well. It entered my property on the northwest corner, ran underground for about 200 feet, and then exited toward the community areas. The wellhead itself was actually on my property, hidden behind a cluster of mesquite trees near the back fence line. I had never noticed it before because it was camouflaged with desert landscaping and a fake rock cover. When I checked the county records, I discovered the well had been drilled in 2001, 3 years after the HOA was established and 8 years before I bought my property. Nobody had ever disclosed its existence to me during the purchase process. On Saturday morning, I drove to a plumbing supply store and bought a high-quality shutoff valve, PVC cement, and various fittings. I also stopped at an electronics store and purchased several outdoor security cameras with night vision and motion detection. By noon, I was back on my property, digging. The water line was buried about 4 feet down, encased in PVC pipe with a diameter of 6 inches. I carefully exposed a 3-foot section, making sure not to damage anything. Then I cut the pipe, installed the shutoff valve, and properly cemented everything back together. The whole process took about 5 hours because I worked carefully, making sure every connection was perfect and leak-free. I installed cameras pointing at the valve location, the pond, and the driveway entrance. Everything was connected to a cloud storage system that would preserve footage even if someone destroyed the physical cameras. Then I buried the valve in a lockable access box, covered it with dirt and native plants, and stepped back to admire my work. At exactly 6 p.m. on Saturday evening, I turned the valve to the closed position. Sunday morning was quiet. I spent the day monitoring my pond, which was slowly recovering with the addition of fresh water from my house. My remaining koi seemed to be improving, though I could tell they were still stressed. Around 2 in the afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. Vincent Yarrow. A man's voice, professional, speaking. This is David Chen, the facilities manager for Meadowbrook Estates HOA. We are experiencing a complete water failure in our common areas. The landscaping system, the pool, everything connected to our main well has stopped flowing. Have you noticed any issues with your water? My water is fine, I said truthfully. My house was connected to the city system, not the well. That is strange. The well appears to be functioning, but nothing is coming through the distribution lines. We have had a crew out here all morning, and they cannot figure out what is wrong. Sounds like a problem for a professional plumber. Yes, well, we have one coming tomorrow. I was just calling to see if you had noticed anything unusual on your property. Some of our infrastructure runs near your back fence line. I have not noticed anything. Been pretty quiet out here. He thanked me and hung up. I allowed myself a small smile. Monday morning, I worked from home, which gave me a perfect view of the activity at the back of my property. Around 10 a.m., a plumbing truck arrived and 2 workers started walking the fence line with detection equipment. They spent hours trying to figure out where the blockage was located. I watched them on my security cameras, saw them scratching their heads and making phone calls. Around 4 p.m., my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Brenda Patterson standing there with David Chen and another man I did not recognize. The third man was younger, maybe in his 30s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a briefcase. "Vincent," Brenda said with absolutely no warmth in her voice, "we need to inspect your property. Our water line runs through your land and something is blocking it. You need a warrant for that, or at minimum my permission. You do not have either." The man in the suit stepped forward. "Mr. Yarrow, I am Jeffrey Brennan, the HOA's legal counsel. According to the easement agreements filed when this neighborhood was developed, the HOA has the right to access and maintain infrastructure on member properties. Show me the easement." He pulled out a document from his briefcase. I took it and read carefully. It was indeed an easement agreement, but it was dated 1999 and signed by the original developer, not by any subsequent property owners. "This easement was never disclosed during my purchase," I said, "which means it may not be valid. But even if it is, it only grants you access for maintenance purposes with proper notice. You did not give me proper notice." "We are giving you notice now," Brenda said. "Let us through." "No, come back with a warrant or a court order." Jeffrey's jaw tightened. "Mr. Yarrow, obstruction of HOA infrastructure is a serious violation of our bylaws. We can fine you up to $500 per day. Go ahead. While you are at it, I will be filing a lawsuit for the 8,000 gallons of water you stole from my pond last week, the death of my $2,000 koi, and the damage to my pond ecosystem. I am thinking we start around $50,000 and see where it goes." Brenda's face turned red. "That water was taken in accordance with our bylaws. Your interpretation of the bylaws, my lawyer disagrees. And I also have senior water rights on the aquifer you are pulling from, which means you may have been stealing my water for years." The three of them exchanged glances. David spoke up, his voice more conciliatory. "Mr. Yarrow, we understand you are upset about the pond situation. Maybe we can work something out. What if the HOA pays to restock your koi and covers the damage to your filtration system? That would be a start. But I also want a formal apology, a guarantee that you will never take water from my property again, and reimbursement for all the time and expense I have had to put into fixing this mess." "That seems excessive," Jeffrey said. "So does draining someone's pond without permission. Ball is in your court. Until we reach an agreement, my property stays closed to HOA access." "You are blocking our water supply," Brenda hissed. "Prove it. As far as I know, you have a well malfunction, not my problem. They left, and I watched their cars disappear down the driveway." That evening, I called Richard Moss and filled him in on everything. He was silent for a long moment after I finished. "You actually installed a shut-off valve on their main line." "I installed a valve on a water line that crosses my property without a properly disclosed easement. I am protecting my water rights. Vincent, this is going to get messy." "It already is messy, but at least now I have leverage." The next few days were tense. The HOA brought in multiple plumbing crews and they eventually traced the problem to somewhere on my property. I denied them access each time they showed up. My mailbox filled with violation notices and fine assessments. I documented everything and forwarded it all to Richard. On Thursday, I received a cease and desist letter from Jeffrey Brennan, demanding that I stop interfering with HOA infrastructure. Richard responded with our own cease and desist, demanding the HOA stop trespassing on my property and pay damages for the pond incident. We also filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Water Resources regarding potential water rights violations. The neighborhood was starting to notice the problems. The pool at the clubhouse was closed because there was no water to maintain it. The elaborate landscaping at the entrance was dying in the Arizona heat. The grass in the common areas was turning brown. Homeowners were calling the HOA office demanding answers. I got several calls from neighbors. Most were confused or concerned, but a few were actually sympathetic once I explained what had happened. A couple named Tom and Linda Garcia, who lived 3 houses down, came by on Friday evening with a bottle of wine. "We heard about your koi pond," Linda said as we sat on my back patio. "Brenda did that without asking, showed up with industrial pumps at 6 in the morning." Tom shook his head. "That woman has been a tyrant since she took over the board 3 years ago. She fined us twice for having our garbage cans visible from the street, even though we only put them out on collection day like everyone else." "I thought I was the only one having problems with her," I said. "Oh no," Linda said. "The Hendersons were talking about moving because she kept citing them for their kids' toys in the backyard. Said it was visible from a neighbor's second-story window and violated aesthetic guidelines. And the Mitchells got a violation notice because their front door was the wrong shade of beige. How does she keep getting re-elected? Most people do not vote in HOA elections," Tom explained. "And the ones who do are usually her friends. Plus, she has made it so complicated to run for the board that nobody wants to deal with it. You need petition signatures. You have to attend every meeting for 6 months prior to the election. All sorts of requirements. Sounds like she has rigged the system." "Completely," Linda agreed. "Look, we do not want to get in the middle of whatever is happening with the water situation, but if you need people to back you up about Brenda's behavior, we will do it." After they left, I started thinking about the bigger picture. This was not just about my pond anymore. Brenda had been abusing her authority for years, and nobody had been able to stop her because she controlled all the levers of power. But now, with the water situation affecting the entire community, maybe people would finally pay attention. I spent the weekend drafting an email to all the homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates. I explained what had happened to my pond, provided photos and documentation, and outlined the water rights issues. I also included information about the HOA's violation history and encouraged people to attend the emergency board meeting that Brenda had scheduled for the following Wednesday. I sent the email Monday morning, and my phone started ringing within an hour. Some people were angry at me for cutting off the water supply. Others were angry at Brenda for creating the mess in the first place. A few people accused me of lying or exaggerating, but a significant number thanked me for finally standing up to the board. Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from a reporter named Sarah Mitchell at the Gilbert Tribune. Someone had forwarded her my email, and she wanted to interview me about the situation. "This sounds like a pretty serious dispute," she said when I met her at a coffee shop near my neighborhood. "An HOA draining a private pond without permission is not something you hear every day." "It gets worse," I said, and walked her through the whole timeline, including the questionable easement and the water rights issues. She took notes rapidly, her eyes widening. "Can I see the documentation?" I showed her everything. Property records, water rights certificates, photos of the pond before and after the deceased koi, the violation notices the HOA had been sending me. She photographed everything with her phone. "This is going to be a great story," she said. "Mind if I reach out to the HOA for their side?" "Please do." The article ran Wednesday morning, just hours before the emergency board meeting. The headline read, "Gilbert HOA accused of water theft, sparking neighborhood dispute." It was fair and balanced, presenting both sides, but the facts were damning for Brenda and her board. The article mentioned the dead koi, the questionable legal authority for taking the water, and the water rights complications. The meeting was held at the clubhouse at 7 p.m., and when I arrived at 6:45, the parking lot was completely full. I had to park on the street. The meeting room, which normally held maybe 30 people comfortably, was packed with at least 80 homeowners. People were standing along the walls and crowding in the doorway. Brenda sat at the front table with the other board members. Jeffrey Brennan, their lawyer, and David Chen, the facilities manager. She looked distinctly uncomfortable as the room filled with angry homeowners. At exactly 7 p.m., she banged a gavel that seemed absurdly small given the chaos in the room. This emergency meeting of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board is now in session. We are here to discuss the current water supply issues affecting our common areas. Someone in the back shouted, "You mean the water you stole from Vincent Yarrow's pond?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Brenda's face tightened. That is a mischaracterization of the situation. The board exercised its authority under Section 12 of the bylaws to utilize available resources during a water shortage emergency. "It was not an emergency," I said from my spot near the middle of the room. "It was landscaping for the front entrance, and you killed my fish." The crowd erupted in overlapping conversations. People were shouting questions and accusations. Brenda banged the gavel repeatedly. "Order! We will have order!" She waited for the noise to die down. "Mr. Yarrow, your interpretation of Section 12 is incorrect. The board has consulted with legal counsel, and our actions were within the scope of our authority." "Then why did not you ask permission?" someone called out. "We are not required to ask permission for emergency resource allocation." Tom Garcia stood up. "Brenda, we are all suffering because of this mess. The pool is closed, the landscaping is dying, and property values are going to tank if this continues. Why do not you just apologize to Vincent and work out a compromise?" "Because the board did nothing wrong," Brenda said stubbornly. "The real problem is Mr. Yarrow's illegal interference with HOA infrastructure. He has blocked access to our water supply, which is affecting every homeowner in this community." "I blocked access to a water line that runs through my property without a properly disclosed easement," I said, standing up so everyone could see me. "The HOA has been drawing water from an aquifer where I hold senior rights. They never bothered to check if they had legal authority to run that line through my land in the first place." Jeffrey Brennan stood up. "Mr. Yarrow, the easement was established in 1999 and is a matter of public record. Your ignorance of its existence does not invalidate it." "Actually, it might," I said, "because easements that materially affect property value are required to be disclosed during real estate transactions in Arizona. The fact that nobody told me a major HOA water line ran through my land could constitute fraud or negligence by the seller, the title company, or both. And even if the easement is valid, it only grants access for maintenance, not for unrestricted resource extraction from my property." A woman I did not recognize raised her hand. "I am confused. Is the well on Vincent's property or not?" "The wellhead is physically located on my land," I said. "I discovered it after this whole mess started. It was hidden and never disclosed to me." The room exploded again. This was news to most people, and they were not happy about it. Several homeowners started demanding answers from the board. How could they drill a well on someone's property without permission? Why was not this information made available to homeowners? What other secrets was the board keeping? Brenda was losing control of the meeting. She kept banging the gavel, but nobody was paying attention anymore. People were arguing among themselves, forming camps. Some supported me, others supported the board, and many were just confused and angry about the whole situation. Finally, a man in his 70s stood up and shouted in a voice that cut through the chaos. "Everyone shut up for a minute." The room went quiet. The man was tall and dignified, with white hair and the bearing of someone used to being in charge. "My name is Robert Harrison, and I was on the original planning commission that approved this development in 1998. I would like to say a few things." Brenda looked like she wanted to object, but the crowd was listening intently to Robert. She waved for him to continue. "When we approved Meadowbrook Estates, there were strict requirements about water usage and aquifer protection. Gilbert was growing rapidly, and we had to be careful about long-term water sustainability. I do not remember anything about a well being drilled on an individual homeowner's parcel. That would have required special permits and approval from the Water Resources Department." He turned to face the board. "Brenda, do you have the permits for that well?" "I am sure they are in our files somewhere," she said defensively. "Then I suggest you produce them. Because if that well was drilled without proper authorization, the HOA could be in violation of state water laws. And if it was drilled on Mr. Yarrow's property without his knowledge or consent, you may have even bigger problems." The meeting continued for another 2 hours. Homeowners asked questions, demanded accountability, and proposed solutions. A group of about 20 people, led by Tom Garcia and Robert Harrison, formed an ad hoc committee to investigate the board's actions and push for reforms. By the end of the night, Brenda looked exhausted and defensive. No resolutions were reached, but the balance of power had clearly shifted. The board no longer had the unconditional support of the community. I went home that night feeling cautiously optimistic. The pressure was building on Brenda and her board, and they were making mistakes. But I also knew this was far from over. Thursday morning, I got a call from Richard Moss. "Vincent, we have a problem. The HOA filed for a temporary restraining order. They are asking a judge to compel you to restore access to their water line while the legal issues are sorted out." "When is the hearing?" "Tomorrow afternoon. Can you be at the Maricopa County Courthouse at 2 p.m.? "I will be there." Friday afternoon, I sat in a courtroom with Richard on one side and Jeffrey Brennan on the other. Judge Andrea Walsh, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed the filings from both sides. "Mr. Brennan, you are asking me to order Mr. Yarrow to restore access to a water line that crosses his property. On what basis?" "Your Honor, the HOA has a valid easement dating back to 1999. Mr. Yarrow's interference with our infrastructure is causing harm to dozens of families who rely on the common area facilities. We are asking for immediate relief while the underlying legal issues are resolved." "Mr. Moss." Richard stood. "Your Honor, the easement in question was never properly disclosed to Mr. Yarrow during his property purchase, which raises serious questions about its enforceability. Furthermore, my client has senior water rights on the aquifer that predates the easement by more than 30 years. The HOA's extraction of water from that aquifer without regard to my client's rights is the actual harm here." "What about the pond incident?" the judge asked. "The HOA, without notice or permission, drained 8,000 gallons from my client's private koi pond, resulting in the death of valuable fish and significant property damage. They claimed emergency authority under their bylaws, but there was no genuine emergency. They wanted water for decorative landscaping." Judge Walsh flipped through the documents. "Mr. Brennan, I am looking at the HOA bylaws here. Section 12 talks about maintenance access and emergency repairs. I do not see anything that explicitly authorizes the taking of private resources like water. It is implied in the language about community betterment, Your Honor. Implied is not the same as explicit, Counselor. This looks to me like the HOA overstepped its authority." She turned to me. "Mr. Yarrow, Have you suffered actual damages from the pond incident? Yes, Your Honor. 2 expensive koi died and the rest of my fish were severely stressed. I have had to spend considerable time and money stabilizing the pond ecosystem. I also have concerns about the long-term health of my remaining fish. And do you have documentation of these damages? Photos, veterinary reports from an aquatic specialist, receipts for the fish purchases and system repairs, all provided in our response filing. She nodded and looked at both lawyers. Here is what I am going to do. I am denying the HOA's request for a temporary restraining order. Based on what I am seeing, Mr. Yarrow has legitimate grievances that need to be addressed before I compel him to do anything. However, I am also ordering both parties to enter into mediation within the next 30 days to resolve this dispute. If you cannot reach an agreement, we will schedule a full hearing on the merits. Brenda, who was sitting behind Jeffrey Brennan, looked furious. She leaned forward and whispered something urgently to him. Your Honor, Jeffrey said, my client is very concerned about the impact on the community. We have dozens of homeowners without pool access, and the landscaping is suffering in the heat. Then I suggest your client should have thought about that before draining Mr. Yarrow's pond without permission. Mediation within 30 days, gentlemen. Make it work. She banged her gavel and the hearing was over. As we left the courthouse, Richard clapped me on the shoulder. That went better than I expected. Walsh is a fair judge, and she clearly thinks the HOA screwed up. What happens in mediation? We sit down with a neutral third party and try to reach a settlement. The mediator cannot force either side to agree, but they can help facilitate negotiation. You need to think about what outcome you want. I want compensation for my losses, a guarantee they will not touch my property again, and probably an apology. Those are reasonable demands, but you might also want to think about the broader community impact. A lot of people are suffering because of this water shutoff. I knew he was right. As much as I wanted to stick it to Brenda, there were innocent homeowners caught in the middle. I will restore the water supply once we have an agreement in writing, not before. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation in Meadowbrook Estates deteriorated. The Arizona heat was brutal in early May, with temperatures hitting the mid-90s. The landscaping at the entrance and around the clubhouse was dead or dying. The pool remained closed, which made the families with kids especially angry. Several homeowners started calling for Brenda's resignation. The ad hoc committee led by Tom Garcia and Robert Harrison got organized. They discovered that the HOA's financial records were a mess, with questionable expenditures and poor documentation. They also found evidence that Brenda had used HOA funds for personal expenses, including charging expensive dinners and spa visits to the association's credit card. On May 15th, the committee filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which regulates HOAs in the state. They alleged financial mismanagement, abuse of authority, and failure to properly maintain common areas. The mediation was scheduled for May 20th at a neutral office in Phoenix. I arrived with Richard, and we were shown to a conference room where Brenda, Jeffrey Brennan, David Chen, and 2 other board members were already waiting. The mediator was a retired judge named Patricia Orozco, who had a reputation for being tough but fair. Patricia started by laying out the ground rules. We are here to find a resolution that works for everyone. Everything said in this room is confidential and cannot be used in court if we do not reach an agreement. I want both sides to speak honestly about their needs and concerns. She asked the HOA to present their position first. Jeffrey outlined their argument about the easement, the emergency authority under the bylaws, and the harm being caused by the water shutoff. Then it was our turn. Richard methodically presented our case: the undisclosed easement, the questionable legal authority for draining the pond, the senior water rights, the death of my koi, and the ongoing damages. Patricia listened carefully, taking notes. When we finished, she said, "Let me make sure I understand. Mr. Yarrow, you want compensation for your losses and assurances that the HOA will not interfere with your property in the future. Is that correct?" "Yes, and a formal apology." She turned to Brenda. "Mrs. Patterson, what is the HOA prepared to offer?" Brenda crossed her arms. "We will agree not to access Mr. Yarrow's pond in the future, but we believe the water shutoff has caused far more damage to the community than anything we did to him. We think this is a disproportionate response." "With all due respect," I said, "you showed up at my house unannounced, drained my pond, and killed my fish. Then you refused to take responsibility and threatened me with fines. The water shutoff is the only leverage I have to make you take this seriously." "The leverage is hurting innocent people," Brenda shot back. Patricia held up a hand. "Let me ask a practical question. Mr. Yarrow, if the HOA compensates you fairly and agrees in writing not to interfere with your property, will you restore the water supply?" "Yes, immediately." "And what do you consider fair compensation?" I looked at Richard, who nodded. $30,000. That covers the dead fish, the pond repairs, the stress on my remaining koi, the time I have spent dealing with this mess, and my legal fees to date." Brenda's eyes went wide. "That is outrageous. Those fish were not worth anywhere near that much. The two that died were worth at least $4,000 total, and the others have suffered health problems that will require ongoing care. Plus, I have spent dozens of hours and significant money fixing the pond ecosystem. And you have forced me to hire a lawyer to protect my own property. $30,000 is actually quite reasonable given the circumstances." Jeffrey whispered to Brenda, who shook her head firmly. "The HOA will offer $10,000, and that is our final number." "Then we do not have a deal," I said. Patricia called for a break, and both sides retreated to separate rooms. Richard and I went to a small office down the hall. "They will go higher," Richard said. "Brenda does not want to, but the other board members know they are in a weak position. The bad publicity, the state investigation, the community anger, all of it is putting pressure on them." "How high do you think they will go?" 25, maybe. You might have to split the difference." We went back into mediation. Patricia had clearly been talking to the HOA because when we reconvened, Jeffrey said, "We can go to 15,000, but that is truly our limit. The HOA's budget is tight, and we have other expenses to cover." 25,000, I countered. "And that includes a written guarantee that the HOA will never access my pond or any other water sources on my property without explicit written permission given at least 72 hours in advance." 20,000, Jeffrey said, "and we will agree to the written guarantee." I looked at Richard, who gave me a subtle nod. 22,000, I said, "final offer." There was a long pause. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but one of the other board members, a man in his 40s, leaned over and whispered something to her. She frowned but nodded. "Fine," Jeffrey said. 22,000, paid within 30 days. The written agreement regarding property access will be executed immediately, and you will restore the water supply as soon as the agreement is signed." "Agreed." Patricia drew up the settlement agreement right there, typing it on her laptop and printing copies for everyone to sign. It took about an hour to get all the language right, but eventually we had a document that satisfied both sides. At 4:30 p.m. on May 20th, I signed the agreement. So did Brenda and the other board members. Richard and Jeffrey witnessed as attorneys. I called my plumber friend that evening and we went out to my property with flashlights. I unlocked the access box, and together we turned the valve back to the open position. Within minutes, water was flowing through the HOA system again. The next morning, I received an email from David Chen confirming that all systems were operational. The pool was being refilled, and they were working on reviving the landscaping. He thanked me for cooperating with the settlement. I expected that to be the end of it, but the story was far from over. The ad hoc committee continued investigating the HOA's finances, and what they found was damning. Brenda had been systematically misusing association funds for years. The expenses she had charged were just the tip of the iceberg. She had also approved inflated contracts with vendors who were giving her kickbacks, failed to get competitive bids on major projects, and generally treated the HOA's money as her personal slush fund. In early June, the Arizona Department of Real Estate completed its investigation and issued a formal citation against the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. The citation detailed multiple violations of state HOA regulations, including failure to maintain proper financial records, unauthorized expenditures, and abuse of authority. Brenda was personally named in the citation and faced potential fines and sanctions. The board called another emergency meeting for June 10th to address the situation. This time, the room was even more packed than before. The ad hoc committee presented their findings to the full community, with Tom Garcia reading from a detailed report. Over the past 3 years, Brenda Patterson has charged over $12,000 in personal expenses to the HOA credit card. She has approved contracts with her brother-in-law's landscaping company at rates 20% higher than market value. She has failed to solicit competitive bids for major repairs, costing the association thousands in unnecessary expenses. And she has consistently used her position to target homeowners who questioned her authority with frivolous violation notices and fines. The crowd was silent, absorbing the information. Then someone stood up and said, "I move that we immediately remove Brenda Patterson from the board." "I second that motion," another voice called. Brenda stood up, her face red. "You cannot do this. There are procedures that have to be followed." Robert Harrison stood up with a thick binder. "Actually, under the bylaws, the homeowners can call for a vote of no confidence at any duly noticed meeting. This meeting was properly noticed and we have a quorum. The vote is in order." Jeffrey Brennan tried to intervene. "This is highly irregular. The board should consult with counsel before proceeding." "The homeowners have the right to vote," Robert said firmly. "Are you trying to deny them that right?" The vote was conducted by show of hands. Out of approximately 90 homeowners present, 83 voted to remove Brenda from the board. Only 7 voted against, mostly her close friends. Brenda gathered her things and stormed out of the meeting, her heels clicking angrily on the floor. 2 other board members who had been closely aligned with her resigned on the spot. The remaining board members called for immediate elections to fill the vacant seats. Tom Garcia, Robert Harrison, and a woman named Susan Winters, who had been particularly vocal about the financial mismanagement, all ran for positions. They were elected unanimously. The new board's first action was to conduct a full audit of the HOA's finances. They hired an independent accounting firm, which spent 3 weeks going through every transaction from the past 5 years. The final report was devastating for Brenda. The accountant found evidence of embezzlement totaling over $45,000. Brenda had been writing checks to herself, disguising them as payments to various vendors and pocketing the difference. She had also been receiving kickbacks from contractors, some of whom admitted to the scheme when interviewed by the accountants. In late July, the new board filed a police report with the Gilbert Police Department. Detective Marcus Rivera was assigned to the case, and he took it very seriously. Financial crimes against HOAs were surprisingly common, and he had seen cases like this before. Detective Rivera interviewed multiple witnesses, including me. I told him about the pond incident and how it had led to the discovery of the broader problems with Brenda's management. He also interviewed Tom, Robert, Susan, and several other homeowners who had been targeted by Brenda. On August 3rd, Detective Rivera showed up at Brenda Patterson's house with a warrant for her arrest. She was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The charges carried potential prison time if convicted. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly Meadowbrook Estates was in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Reporters camped outside the neighborhood entrance, trying to interview homeowners. Sarah Mitchell from the Gilbert Tribune wrote a follow-up article detailing the whole saga from the pond incident to the embezzlement charges. Brenda posted bail and immediately hired a high-profile criminal defense attorney. She maintained her innocence, claiming that any financial irregularities were the result of poor bookkeeping, not intentional fraud. But the evidence was overwhelming. In September, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office offered Brenda a plea deal. If she agreed to plead guilty to reduce charges, repay the stolen money, and accept probation instead of prison time, they would drop the most serious felony counts. Her lawyer advised her to take the deal, and on September 28th, she stood in court and pleaded guilty to 1 count of theft and 2 counts of fraudulent schemes. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, ordered to repay $45,000 to the HOA, and banned from serving on any HOA board in Arizona for 10 years. She also had to perform 200 hours of community service. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom. When Brenda made her statement to the judge, she never once apologized to the homeowners or took real responsibility for what she had done. She talked about how stressful it was to volunteer her time to serve the community, how she had made some mistakes in judgment, and how she hoped to move forward with her life. Judge Christopher Hayes was not impressed. "Mrs. Patterson, you held a position of trust, and you abused it for personal gain. The people of Meadowbrook Estates relied on you to manage their money responsibly, and instead, you treated the HOA as your personal piggy bank. This sentence is lenient compared to what you deserve, but the prosecution has agreed to this deal, and I am bound by that agreement. I hope you use this opportunity to reflect on the harm you have caused." As Brenda left the courtroom, she did not look at anyone. Her husband, who had attended every hearing, followed her out with his head down. The HOA received the first restitution payment in October. The new board used the money to replenish the reserve fund that Brenda had depleted and to make much-needed repairs to the clubhouse and common areas. My $22,000 settlement arrived in early June, right on schedule. I used most of it to restock my pond with new koi and upgrade the filtration system. I also planted additional vegetation around the pond to create a more natural habitat for wildlife. By September, my pond was thriving again. The koi were healthy and growing, and I had even seen a great blue heron visit a few times. The ecosystem I had spent years building was recovering from the damage Brenda had caused. One evening in late October, Tom Garcia and his wife Linda came by with a bottle of wine to celebrate. We sat on my back patio, watching the sun set over the pond. "You know," Tom said, "if you had not stood up to Brenda, none of this would have come out." She would still be stealing from the HOA, and the rest of us would still be suffering under her dictatorship. "I was just protecting my property," I said. "I did not set out to bring down the board." "But you did, and we are all better off for it," Linda said. "The new board is transparent. They actually listen to homeowners, and they are running the HOA like a real community organization instead of a personal fiefdom." "Whatever happened to Jeffrey Brennan?" I asked. "Fired," Tom said with satisfaction. "The new board hired a different law firm that actually knows HOA law and does not just rubber stamp whatever the president wants." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the water feature in the pond and the evening sounds of the desert. A family of quail wandered across my lawn, and my koi rose to the surface to feed on insects. "How much was that big white one worth?" Linda asked, pointing to my largest koi, a stunning platinum agon that shimmered in the fading light. "About 3,000, I said. "I imported him from a breeder in Niigata, Japan. Took me a year to get him." "And Brenda wanted to use that water for some petunias at the entrance," Tom said, shaking his head. Unbelievable. By November, life in Meadowbrook Estates had returned to normal, or at least a better version of normal. The new board was competent and responsive. Homeowners were engaged and actually attended meetings. The common areas were properly maintained without anyone having to steal water from private ponds. I ran into David Chen at the grocery store one Saturday morning. He had survived the transition and was still the facilities manager. "Vincent," he said, looking slightly uncomfortable, "I want to apologize for my role in the pond incident. I was just following orders from the board, but I should have questioned whether it was the right thing to do." "I appreciate that," I said. "No hard feelings. You were in a tough position." "The new board is much better to work for," he said. "They actually want input from staff instead of just dictating everything." "That is good to hear. And I wanted you to know, we have properly documented the easement for the well on your property now. We also installed monitoring equipment so we can make sure we are not exceeding our water allocation from the aquifer." Robert Harrison insisted on it. "That is the way it should have been done from the beginning." Agreed. As I drove home that day, I reflected on everything that had happened. What started as an early morning violation of my property had turned into a months-long battle that exposed corruption, led to criminal charges, and ultimately reformed an entire HOA. I thought about Sunset, my Kohaku koi who had died because of Brenda's arrogance and greed. In a way, his death had not been meaningless. It had sparked a chain of events that brought justice and positive change to dozens of families. When I got home, I stood by the pond for a long time, watching my koi swim in the clear water. They were healthy and content, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded around them. The pond was peaceful again, a sanctuary from the stress of the outside world. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard Moss. "Saw the news about Brenda's sentencing. Congrats on the outcome. Let me know if you need anything else." I typed back, "Thanks for everything. Hopefully I will not need an HOA lawyer again anytime soon." In my experience, there is always another HOA drama waiting around the corner, but you know where to find me. I put my phone away and sat down on the stone bench I had installed near the pond's edge. The late afternoon sun cast golden light across the water, and a light breeze rustled through the mesquite trees. Everything was exactly as it should be. A year later, I was still living peacefully in Meadowbrook Estates. The new HOA board had implemented reforms that made the association more democratic and transparent. They published detailed financial reports quarterly, held regular open forums for homeowners to voice concerns, and made sure all major decisions were voted on by the community. Tom Garcia was elected president, and he ran the board with competence and integrity. He would occasionally call me for advice on water issues or property rights questions, and I was happy to help. Brenda Patterson moved out of the neighborhood in the spring. I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband had relocated to Scottsdale, trying to make a fresh start away from the scandal. She was still on probation and working to pay back the restitution money. As for me, I continued to work at Boeing, came home to my peaceful 5 acres, and spent my evenings by the pond. I added 3 more koi to my collection, including a beautiful showa that reminded me of sunset. My pond had become something of a neighborhood attraction, and I would occasionally invite people over to enjoy the tranquility. One evening in May, almost exactly a year after the settlement, I was doing maintenance on the pond's filtration system when I heard a car pull up. I walked around to the front of the house and saw Tom and Linda Garcia getting out, along with Robert Harrison and several other neighbors. "We wanted to bring you something," Tom said, holding a framed certificate. I took it and read, "Presented to Vincent Yarrow in recognition of his courage and integrity in standing up for homeowner rights and exposing corruption in the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. Your actions made our community stronger and more just, with gratitude from your neighbors." Below the text were dozens of signatures, practically everyone in the neighborhood. I was genuinely touched. "You guys did not have to do this." "Yes, we did," Robert said. "You took a risk when you stood up to Brenda. You could have just rolled over and accepted what happened, but instead you fought back. And because you did, all of us are better off. Plus," Linda added with a grin, "you taught us that sometimes the best way to deal with an abusive HOA is to cut off their water supply." Everyone laughed, and we spent the next hour sitting around my patio, sharing stories and enjoying the desert evening. As I looked at the faces of my neighbors, people who had become genuine friends through this ordeal, I realized that something good had come from all the chaos and conflict. My pond had been the catalyst for change, and though the journey had been difficult and stressful, the destination was worth it. Meadowbrook Estates was now a real community, not just a collection of houses governed by a petty tyrant. People looked out for each other, spoke up when things were wrong, and worked together to solve problems. As the sun set that evening and my guests eventually headed home, I stood by the pond one last time. My koi swam lazily through the clear water, healthy and content. The water level was perfect, maintained by the natural aquifer flow, and supplemented by my house system as needed. No one would ever drain this pond again without my permission. I thought about everything that had happened, from that shocking early morning when I saw industrial pumps stealing my water, to the confrontations with Brenda, to the legal battles and community upheaval, to finally watching justice be served in a courtroom. It had been a long road, but I would do it all again if necessary. Property rights matter. Community integrity matters. Standing up to abuse of power matters. These were not just abstract principles. They were real things that affected real people's lives every single day. I went inside that night and slept soundly, knowing that my home was truly mine, protected by law and by a community that had learned the hard way why those protections exist. The pond burbled softly outside my window, a peaceful reminder that sometimes fighting back is not just right, it is necessary. And if another HOA president ever showed up with pumps and an entitled attitude, well, I now knew exactly what to do. I had the lawyer's number on speed dial, detailed documentation of my water rights, and a neighborhood full of allies who would back me up. But more importantly, I had proven to myself that ordinary people can stand up to institutional power and win. The story of my pond had become legendary in Meadowbrook Estates, a cautionary tale told to new board members about what happens when you forget that HOAs exist to serve homeowners, not to rule over them. It was a lesson hard learned but well remembered, and our community was stronger for it.